Before diving into this sweeping story of dignity and transformation, ask yourself, what happens when a man presents his mistress as his wife, certain that the real one will never appear? Can a simple entrance into a ballroom, silent, elegant and ruthless, change an entire narrative of power and appearance? If you're ready to witness how a single night can forever redefine a man's image and reignite a woman's spirit, then subscribe to our channel now, turn on notifications and get ready. Because the next stories will move you. The grand ballroom of the Langham Hotel glittered like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with gold leaf and silk tapestries. London's elite had gathered for the annual Charity Foundation Gala, an event that served as much as a showcase of wealth and influence as it did for philanthropic purposes. The cream of British society mingled beneath the ornate ceiling, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of champagne flutes and the soft rustle of expensive fabrics. Richard Monteverde cut an impressive figure as he entered the ballroom, his tailored dinner jacket fitting his tall frame perfectly. At 52, he possessed the kind of distinguished bearing that came from years of successful business dealings and social prominence. His steel-grey hair was impeccably styled, and his confident smile spoke of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. But it was his companion who drew the most attention that evening. Sophie Hartwell moved with the grace of youth, her 28 years evident in every fluid step. Her emerald silk gown hugged her curves in all the right places, the deep neckline and flowing train creating an ensemble that was both sophisticated and subtly provocative. Diamond earrings caught the light as she turned her head, and her auburn hair was swept up in an elegant chignon that showcased her swan-like neck. She was, by any measure, a stunning woman. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Sophie," Richard said, with practiced ease to Lord Hamilton, one of London's most influential banking magnates. The lie rolled off his tongue as smoothly as aged whiskey, and Sophie played her part to perfection, extending her gloved hand with just the right amount of warmth and reserve. "Charmed, Mrs. Monteverde," Lord Hamilton replied, his eyes lingering perhaps a moment too long on Sophie's décolletage before returning to Richard's face. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure before." "Sophie prefers to keep a low profile," Richard explained smoothly. "She's not one for the social circuit, are you, darling?" Sophie smiled demurely, her performance flawless. "I find these gatherings overwhelming at times, but Richard insists I accompany him to the important events." The conversation flowed easily from there, touching on market trends, political developments, and mutual acquaintances. Richard basked in the admiring glances Sophie received, each one a testament to his own desirability and success. Here was a man who could attract and keep a woman half his age, a woman of obvious breeding and beauty. It was exactly the image he had cultivated so carefully over the past 2 years. As they moved through the crowd, Richard introduced Sophie to banker after banker, politician after politician, socialite after socialite. Each introduction followed the same pattern. "My wife, Sophie." The words came so naturally now that he almost believed them himself. Almost. "Richard Monteverde!" Lady Pemberton's voice rang out across the marble floor. "How wonderful to see you! And this must be the mysterious Mrs. Monteverde we've heard so much about." Sophie accepted the compliment with practiced grace, discussing her supposed interest in art restoration and her fictional volunteer work with various charities. She had studied her role well, armed with enough knowledge to navigate any conversation without revealing the truth of her identity. The evening progressed splendidly. Richard sealed a preliminary deal with a German industrialist over canapés, discussed a potential merger with a telecommunications mogul during the soup course, and arranged a golf game with a prominent MP between the fish and the meat. Sophie proved an invaluable asset, her beauty drawing people into their orbit, while her carefully rehearsed conversation kept them engaged. "You've outdone yourself tonight, darling," Richard whispered in Sophie's ear as they swayed together during the orchestra's rendition of a Viennese waltz. "I don't think there's a man in this room who doesn't envy me." Sophie smiled up at him, her green eyes sparkling in the soft light. "I do enjoy playing the role of Mrs. Monteverdi," she murmured back. "It has such a distinguished ring to it." "Oh." The champagne flowed freely, and with each passing hour, Richard felt more secure in his deception. Isabel was nothing more than a ghost from his past now, a bitter woman who had retreated from society years ago, nursing her wounded pride in the shadows of their empty Belgravia townhouse. She had become irrelevant, a footnote in the story of his success. As the evening wore on, Richard allowed himself to believe that he had successfully rewritten his personal history. In the minds of London's elite, he was now a happily married man with a beautiful, accomplished wife. The truth of his failing marriage, his separation, and his affair had been carefully buried beneath layers of social manipulation and strategic absence. The perfect night was unfolding exactly as he had planned. In the gilded drawing rooms and exclusive clubs of Mayfair, whispered conversations often turned to the curious case of Isabel Monteverdi. Once a fixture at every important social gathering, she had seemingly vanished from London society like morning mist, leaving behind only fragments of memory and speculation. Whatever happened to Richard's wife? Lady Pemberton had asked her bridge partners just weeks earlier. "I haven't seen hide nor hair of her in, goodness, must be 3 years now." "I heard she took it rather badly when Richard's business troubles started," offered Mrs. Whitmore, dealing the cards with practiced efficiency. "Some women simply can't handle the pressure, you know." "But his business recovered beautifully," interjected Lady Ashford, arranging her hand. "He's more successful than ever." Surely she would have emerged from whatever hole she crawled into by now. The truth, as it often is in such matters, was far more complex than the society gossips imagined. Isabel Monteverdi had not retreated in defeat or shame. Rather, she had made a calculated decision to withdraw from a world that had begun to feel increasingly hollow and false. While Richard threw himself into his work and eventually his affair, Isabel had found solace in quieter pursuits. She had returned to her first love, literature. The woman who had once graced charity committees and fundraising galas now spent her days in the reading room of the British Library, pursuing a doctorate in Victorian literature that she had abandoned 20 years earlier for marriage. Her thesis on the intersection of social reform and women's writing had earned quiet acclaim in academic circles that rarely intersected with her former social set. The Belgravia townhouse, once a showcase for entertaining, had been transformed into a sanctuary of books and scholarship. The formal dining room, where she had once hosted dinner parties for Richard's business associates, now served as her study, its walls lined with volumes of Dickens, Gaskell, and Brontë. The elegant sitting room where she had poured tea for wives of politicians and bankers was now her writing space, where she crafted essays on social consciousness in 19th century fiction. But if London society had forgotten Isabel, she had not forgotten them. From her academic perch, she watched with growing fascination as Richard's narrative about their marriage began to shift. At first, the explanations for her absence had been innocent enough. Isabel was traveling, or unwell, or simply preferred privacy. But gradually the story had evolved. Through carefully maintained connections, her former secretary, a discreet hairdresser, a loyal friend in the art world, Isabel had tracked the subtle transformation of her reputation. She was no longer simply absent. She had become someone who had never quite fit in, who had been overwhelmed by the social demands, who had chosen to step back from a life she couldn't handle. The narrative reached its crescendo with Sophie's introduction to society. Suddenly, Isabel wasn't merely absent, she was being actively replaced. The woman who had shared Richard's name and bed for 15 years was being systematically erased from his history, her role reassigned to a younger, more decorative substitute. Meanwhile, Sophie Hartwell moved through London society with the confidence of someone who had never known real struggle. Born to comfortable middle-class parents in Surrey, she had been educated at respectable schools and had worked briefly as a gallery assistant in Chelsea before catching Richard's eye at an art exhibition 2 years prior. She was intelligent enough to be interesting, beautiful enough to be envied, and ambitious enough to embrace her role as Richard's unofficial wife without question. At 28, Sophie saw her relationship with Richard as the logical culmination of her carefully planned ascent through London's social hierarchy. She had studied the wives of successful men, noting their mannerisms, their conversation topics, their fashion choices. She understood that being Richard Monteverdi's wife, even an unofficial one, opened doors that her own background never could have unlocked. In her Kensington flat, furnished with pieces Richard had bought her, Sophie prepared for each social engagement, like an actress preparing for a performance. She researched the guest lists, memorized biographical details about important attendees, and practiced conversations in front of her mirror. The role of Mrs. Monteverdi was one she had crafted carefully, building it from observations and aspirations rather than lived experience. What Sophie didn't know, what Richard himself was only beginning to understand, was that Isabel had never signed divorce papers. Legally, Mrs. Monteverdi was still very much alive, still very much married, and still very much entitled to everything that name represented. In her book-lined study, Isabel had spent months watching Richard's social resurrection with the detached interest of a scholar observing a fascinating historical phenomenon. She had no desire to return to the shallow waters of high society, but she found herself increasingly intrigued by the audacity of Richard's deception and the complicity of their former friends in accepting his rewritten history. The invitation to the Charity Foundation gala had arrived at the Belgravia house by mistake, a clerical error that placed it in her hands instead of Sophie's. As Isabel held the heavy cardstock, she realized that fate had presented her with an opportunity she had never sought but couldn't ignore. For the first time in 3 years, Mrs. Isabel Monteverdi began to plan her return to society. The orchestra had just finished a spirited rendition of Strauss when the massive oak doors of the ballroom opened with a soft but unmistakable creak. The sound, barely audible above the gentle hum of conversation and the clink of crystal, somehow managed to capture the attention of several guests near the entrance. What they saw in the doorway caused a ripple effect of turned heads and hushed whispers that spread through the crowd like wildfire. Isabel Monteverdi stood framed in the entrance, and she was absolutely magnificent. The emerald green gown she wore was a masterpiece of understated elegance, silk that seemed to flow like liquid jade, cut in classic lines that emphasized her natural grace rather than clinging desperately to youth. The dress was sophisticated rather than revealing, its beauty lying in the perfect marriage of exceptional fabric and flawless tailoring. Her dark hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was swept into an elegant chignon, secured with what appeared to be her grandmother's antique diamond pins. Around her throat lay a simple strand of pearls that caught the light with each breath. But it was not her attire that commanded attention, it was her presence. At 45, Isabel possessed something that youth and beauty alone could never achieve: true dignity. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Her posture was perfect without being rigid, her expression serene without being vacant. When her dark eyes swept across the room, they held the calm intelligence of someone who saw clearly and judged fairly. The effect on the assembled guests was immediate and profound. Lady Pemberton, who had been in the middle of recounting a rather scandalous story about a mutual acquaintance, stopped mid-sentence, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Lord Hamilton, deep in conversation about European market conditions, found his attention inexplicably drawn to the entrance, where a woman of unmistakable class and bearing commanded the space without saying a word. "Good God," whispered Mrs. Whitmore to her companion. "Is that—" "Isabel Monteverde," confirmed Lady Ashford, her voice barely audible. "I'd recognize that bearing anywhere. But what on earth is she doing here?" The question rippled through the crowd in various forms. Isabel Monteverde, the woman who had vanished from society without explanation, who had become more myth than memory in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, had returned. And she had chosen this night, this event, this particular gathering, to make her reappearance. Near the center of the ballroom, Richard felt the change in atmosphere before he understood its cause. Conversations around him had taken on a different quality, hushed, urgent, electric with curiosity. Sophie, who had been charming a group of wives with her carefully rehearsed stories about art restoration, noticed that her audience's attention had wandered. Their eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, and their polite smiles had been replaced by expressions of fascination and confusion. "Richard," Sophie whispered, touching his arm lightly, "something's happening. Everyone's looking at—" He turned, following the collective gaze of the room, and felt the world shift beneath his feet. There she was, Isabel, not the bitter, defeated woman he had left behind in Belgravia, but someone transformed, or perhaps someone who had simply remembered who she truly was. She stood in the doorway with the poise of a queen surveying her domain, seemingly unaware of the sensation her arrival had created. For a moment that stretched into eternity, husband and wife looked at each other across the crowded ballroom. In that single glance, years of separation, betrayal, and carefully constructed lies seemed to hang in the air between them. Richard felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack, while Isabel's expression remained perfectly composed, neither hostile nor welcoming, but absolutely present. The orchestra, oblivious to the drama unfolding, began a new piece. The mundane act of musicians playing somehow broke the spell, and conversations gradually resumed, though in more subdued tones. Guests found excuses to move closer to wherever Isabel might go, eager to witness whatever would happen next. Sophie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had prepared for many scenarios in her role as Richard's unofficial wife, but she had never prepared for this. The existence of the real Mrs. Monteverde had been an abstract concept, a legal inconvenience that existed somewhere in the background of her carefully constructed reality. Now, suddenly, that abstract concept had taken flesh and was moving through the ballroom with unmistakable authority. Isabel began to move into the room, accepting greetings from old acquaintances with gracious warmth. Her progress was unhurried but purposeful, like a ship moving through calm waters. She seemed genuinely pleased to reconnect with people she had once known well, asking about their children, their travels, their recent endeavors, with the kind of attentive interest that made each person feel valued and remembered. "Isabel!" Lady Pemberton approached with the determination of someone who had to know what was happening. "My dear, what a wonderful surprise. We've missed you terribly. You look absolutely radiant." "Thank you, Caroline," Isabel replied, her voice warm but controlled. "I've been keeping rather busy with my research, but I felt it was time to reconnect with old friends. Some occasions are too important to miss." The words were innocuous enough, but they carried an undertone that made those listening wonder exactly what she meant. What research? What important occasion? And why now, after 3 years of complete absence from society? As Isabel continued her graceful progress through the room, the evening's carefully established dynamics began to shift. The spotlight that had shone so brightly on Sophie began to dim, not through any aggressive action, but simply through the presence of someone whose claim to the name Mrs. Monteverde was indisputable and whose natural magnetism drew people into her orbit. Richard remained frozen near the center of the room, watching his carefully constructed world begin to tilt on its axis, while Sophie struggled to understand how a single entrance could change everything so completely. The perfect night had just become perfectly unpredictable. The inevitable moment arrived during the second course, as guests enjoyed a delicate salmon terrine paired with a crisp Sancerre. Richard had watched Isabel's progress through the ballroom with the fascination of someone observing an approaching storm, beautiful, powerful, and potentially devastating. He could no longer postpone the confrontation that everyone in the room was expecting. With the practiced composure that had served him well in countless business negotiations, Richard excused himself from his table and began the long walk across the ballroom floor. Each step felt weighted with history and consequence. Conversations paused as he passed, guests' eyes following his progress with barely concealed anticipation. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the meeting between Richard Monteverdi and the wife he had so thoroughly replaced. Sophie watched from their table, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. She understood that this conversation would determine not just the remainder of the evening, but possibly the entire future of her carefully constructed role in Richard's life. The woman she had been effortlessly replacing was no longer an abstract concept, but a flesh and blood reality moving through their world with undeniable legitimacy. Isabel stood near the windows overlooking the Thames, engaged in conversation with Sir James Morrison, the retired Foreign Secretary, and his wife. She had chosen her position well, close enough to the main gathering to remain part of the evening's social fabric, but far enough away to create a sense of privacy for whatever confrontation might come. When she saw Richard approaching, she didn't flee or brace herself for battle. Instead, she simply concluded her conversation with the Morrisons and turned to face him with the same serene composure she had maintained all evening. "Richard," she said simply, her voice carrying no particular warmth, but no hostility either. It was the tone one might use when greeting a colleague after a long absence, professional, neutral, acknowledging their shared history without inviting intimacy. "Isabel." He stopped at an appropriate distance, neither too close nor too far. The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words and unresolved history. "I must say this is unexpected." "Is it?" She tilted her head slightly, a gesture he remembered from their early years together when she was considering a particularly interesting point in conversation. "The invitation arrived at Belgravia. I assumed it was intentional." They both knew it wasn't, but Richard chose not to challenge the fiction. Around them, conversations continued, but he was acutely aware that every nearby guest was straining to hear their exchange. The situation required delicate handling. Too much familiarity would expose the lie he had been living, but too much hostility would create exactly the sort of scene that would be dissected in drawing rooms across London for months to come. "You look well," he said finally. It was true. She looked better than well. The stress lines that had marked her face during the final years of their marriage had smoothed away, replaced by the kind of contentment that came from finding one's true purpose in life. "Thank you. Academic life agrees with me." She accepted the compliment with grace, but didn't return it. "I've been quite absorbed in my research on Victorian social reform literature. Fascinating how the past can illuminate the present, don't you think?" The comment carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on either of them. In her academic work, Isabel had been studying how society's most vulnerable members were often rendered invisible by those in power, a theme that had particular resonance given her current circumstances. "I'm sure it keeps you busy," Richard replied, struggling to maintain the casual tone. "I hadn't realized you were still in London." "Oh yes, still at Belgravia. The house suits my current needs perfectly. All those rooms make excellent studies and libraries, so much space for books and papers." Her emphasis on the house was subtle but pointed. It was, after all, their house, purchased during their marriage and never formally divided in any divorce proceedings that had never actually occurred. Richard felt a bead of perspiration form at his temple, despite the evening's cool temperature. Every word of this conversation felt like a chess move, and he was beginning to realize that Isabel was several steps ahead of him in whatever game they were playing. "I trust you're enjoying the evening," he said, grasping for safer conversational ground. "Immensely. It's wonderful to reconnect with old friends. So many people have been asking about me. Apparently there was some confusion about my status. I've been happy to clarify matters." Her smile was perfectly pleasant and absolutely terrifying. The implication was clear. She had been correcting misconceptions about her absence, her role in Richard's life, and quite possibly her legal standing as his wife. With each clarification, the carefully constructed fiction of his relationship with Sophie became more precarious. "Isabel, perhaps we should—" "Oh, you must excuse me," she interrupted smoothly, looking past his shoulder. "I see Lord Pemberton heading this way, and I promised Caroline I would speak with him about his new charity initiative. You know how passionate I am about causes that help the overlooked and forgotten members of society." The barb was delivered with such grace that it took Richard a moment to fully register its impact. By the time he processed the implication that she saw herself as one of society's overlooked and forgotten members who now required championing, she was already moving away, leaving him standing alone near the windows. Their first encounter was over, and Richard realized with growing unease that he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. Isabel had managed to remind him of her legitimate claim to their shared name, their shared property, and their shared history, all while maintaining the perfect facade of civilized conversation. As he watched her glide away toward Lord Pemberton, Richard began to understand that his wife's 3-year absence from society had not been a retreat at all. It had been a strategic withdrawal, and now she had returned not as the defeated woman he had expected, but as someone who had spent her time in exile preparing for exactly this moment. The perfect night was becoming a perfect nightmare, and it was only just beginning. What followed was a masterclass in social warfare conducted with such subtlety that casual observers might have missed its significance entirely. Isabel moved through the ballroom with the grace of someone born to the role, but there was nothing accidental about her path or her interactions. Each conversation, each greeting, each carefully timed smile served a strategic purpose in what was becoming an intricate game of social chess. Her first stop was Lady Pemberton's circle, where the conversation naturally turned to cultural pursuits. "I've been so immersed in my doctoral work," Isabel explained, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of genuine accomplishment. "My research focuses on how Victorian women writers used their platforms to expose social hypocrisies. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's work on the economic dependence of women has been particularly illuminating." The subtle message wasn't lost on the more perceptive members of the group. Here was a woman who had used her time away from society to achieve something substantial, something that had nothing to do with her husband's success or status. She was no longer merely Richard Monteverdi's wife. She was Dr. Isabel Monteverdi, scholar and researcher in her own right. Mrs. Whitmore, ever eager for intellectual conversation, leaned forward with interest. "How fascinating! I had no idea you were pursuing academic work. Where are you completing your doctorate?" "King's College," Isabel replied, and the prestige of the institution added another layer to her growing mystique. "Professor Williams has been incredibly supportive of my research. We're hoping to publish a comprehensive study on women's economic agency in Victorian literature by next spring." The conversation continued, but word of Isabel's academic achievements began to spread through the room like ripples on a pond. This was no bitter, abandoned wife seeking sympathy or revenge. This was an accomplished woman who had transformed her absence from society into something productive and respectable, something that elevated rather than diminished her standing. Meanwhile, Richard found himself in increasingly awkward conversations. Where once guests had complimented him on his beautiful wife Sophie, now they peppered him with questions about Isabel's research, her degree, her plans for publication. The assumption that Sophie was his wife became harder to maintain when people were asking specific questions about the real Mrs. Monteverdi's academic career. "I had no idea Isabel was working on a doctorate," Lord Hamilton mentioned during their discussion of quarterly earnings reports. "She's always been remarkably intelligent, of course, but I didn't realize she had such scholarly inclinations. You must be very proud." Richard managed a non-committal response, but the comment highlighted a growing problem. The more people learned about Isabel's genuine accomplishments during her absence, the more his explanation of her retreat from society fell apart. She hadn't withdrawn in defeat or shame. She had withdrawn to pursue something meaningful. Sophie, increasingly isolated at their table, watched the evening's dynamics shift with growing alarm. Conversations that had once naturally included her now seemed to flow around her. When she attempted to join discussions about literature or academic research, her carefully memorized talking points about art restoration seemed shallow by comparison. She was beautiful, charming, and well prepared for the role she had been playing, but she was not and could never be the genuine article. Isabel's next strategic move was even more brilliant in its simplicity. During a lull in the evening's program, she approached Margaret Thornfield, the evening's event coordinator and one of London's most connected socialites. "Margaret, dear," Isabel said warmly, embracing the older woman with genuine affection, "I owe you an enormous apology for my absence from the committee meetings. I know the Literacy Foundation suffered without proper attention to the fundraising initiatives." Mrs. Thornfield's face lit up with delight and relief. "Isabel, oh my dear, we've missed you terribly. The foundation has limped along, but it hasn't been the same without your vision and energy. Please tell me you're considering returning to active involvement." "Actually, I was hoping to discuss that with you. My research has given me wonderful insights into educational initiatives for underserved populations. I think we could develop some groundbreaking programs if we combined academic research with practical outreach." Within moments, Isabel was surrounded by board members of various charitable organizations, all eager to welcome back someone they remembered as an effective and committed volunteer. Her academic credentials added new weight to her natural organizational abilities, making her an even more valuable addition to their causes than she had been before. The brilliance of this move became apparent as the evening progressed. Isabel wasn't just reclaiming her social position, she was strengthening it. She was demonstrating that her absence had been productive and purposeful, that she had used the time to develop new skills and insights that made her more valuable than ever to the causes and organizations that mattered to London's social elite. Richard watched this renaissance with growing unease. Each reconnection, each renewed commitment, each demonstration of Isabel's continued relevance in their shared social world made his own position more precarious. If Isabel was reclaiming her role as Mrs. Monteverdi in charitable circles, in academic circles, and in the broader social landscape, where did that leave Sophie? The answer to that question was becoming increasingly apparent as the evening wore on. Sophie found herself with fewer conversation partners, less attention, and a growing sense that she was becoming invisible in a room where she had entered as the evening's star. By the time the main course was served, the balance of power in the ballroom had shifted completely. Isabel had re-established herself not as Richard's abandoned wife, but as an accomplished woman with her own achievements, her own connections, and her own legitimate claim to the social position she had temporarily vacated. The game was being played at the highest level, and Richard was beginning to realize that he was outmatched. The transformation was as subtle as it was devastating. Sophie Hartwell, who had entered the ballroom as the radiant center of attention, now found herself increasingly peripheral to conversations that had once revolved around her. The change was not dramatic. No one was openly rude or obviously dismissive, but the cumulative effect of 100 small shifts in attention and interest was unmistakable. It began with glances. Where once eyes had followed Sophie's movements with admiration and curiosity, now they were drawn elsewhere, toward the corner where Isabel held court with a group of charitable foundation directors, or toward Richard, whose discomfort was becoming increasingly apparent to those who knew how to read social situations. Mrs. Whitmore, who had spent the cocktail hour asking Sophie detailed questions about art restoration techniques, now seemed distracted when Sophie tried to continue their earlier conversation. "Oh, yes, restoration work," Mrs. Whitmore replied absently, her attention clearly elsewhere. "That must be quite interesting. Excuse me, dear, I simply must hear what Isabel is saying about Victorian women's literature. Such a fascinating field." The dismissal was polite but absolute. Sophie was left standing alone, watching as someone who had once seemed like ancient history commanded the attention that had been hers just hours earlier. The irony was not lost on her. She was experiencing firsthand the kind of social abandonment she had unwittingly participated in by allowing herself to be introduced as Richard's wife. Young Lady Ashford, who had earlier complimented Sophie's dress and jewelry with genuine enthusiasm, now approached with the kind of awkward smile that preceded uncomfortable conversations. "Miss, forgive me, but I'm suddenly uncertain of your name. There seems to be some confusion about—" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized that her carefully constructed identity was beginning to crumble. "Hartwell," she said quietly. "Sophie Hartwell." "Ah." Lady Ashford nodded with the expression of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "And you're here with Richard as—" The pause was excruciating. Sophie had spent 2 years confidently introducing herself as Mrs. Monteverdi, but with the real Mrs. Monteverdi holding forth across the room about her doctoral research, that claim had become impossible to maintain. "A friend," she said finally, the word feeling inadequate and somehow shameful. Lady Ashford's smile became more genuine, but it was the kind of sympathy one might offer to a child who had been caught in an embarrassing lie. "Of course. Well, it was lovely meeting you, dear." The conversation ended there, and Lady Ashford drifted away toward more substantial social prey. Sophie was left to contemplate the devastating efficiency with which her carefully constructed persona was being dismantled, not through any direct attack, but simply through the presence of reality itself. From across the room, she watched Richard attempt to navigate conversations that had become increasingly complex. Where once his introduction of her as his wife had been accepted without question, now people were asking follow-up questions that revealed the impossibility of his deception. How could he be married to Sophie when his actual wife was standing 20 feet away, discussing her academic career with Lord Pemberton? The logistics of the lie had become untenable, and Sophie could see the strain it was placing on Richard. His usual confidence was cracking under the pressure of maintaining a fiction that had become obviously false to anyone paying attention. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air, and his typically smooth conversational style was becoming stilted and defensive. Sophie found herself remembering their first meeting at the Chelsea Gallery 2 years earlier. Richard had been confident then too, sweeping into her modest world with promises of a life she had never dared imagine. He had made it seem so simple. She would be his companion, his hostess, his unofficial wife in all but legal standing. He had painted a picture of elegant dinner parties, cultural events, and social prominence that had dazzled her 26-year-old self. What he had failed to mention was the possibility that the official wife might someday return to claim what was rightfully hers. In all their carefully planned preparations for social events, they had never rehearsed for this scenario. Sophie had studied the mannerisms of successful wives, memorized talking points about art and charity work, and perfected the kind of gracious smile that photographs well in society magazines. But she had never prepared for the moment when she would have to defend her right to exist in the role she had assumed. Now, standing at the margins of conversations that had once centered around her, Sophie was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about her position in Richard's life. She was not irreplaceable. She was simply convenient. She was not his partner. She was his accessory, and accessories, no matter how beautiful or well-chosen, could always be exchanged for something more suitable to the occasion. The realization was painful but clarifying. As she watched Isabel command attention through genuine accomplishment and authentic relationships, Sophie understood that she had been playing a role that was fundamentally hollow. She was a beautiful young woman pretending to be something she was not, while Isabel was an accomplished woman reclaiming something that had always been authentically hers. The contrast was not flattering to Sophie, and she was beginning to suspect that everyone in the room could see it as clearly as she was starting to understand it herself. The perfect night had become a perfect education in the difference between borrowed status and earned respect, and the lesson was far from over. The opportunity for a private conversation arose during the orchestra's intermission, when most guests had moved toward the terrace for fresh air and casual mingling. Isabel had positioned herself near the French doors leading to the garden, where the soft light from paper lanterns created an intimate setting that was nevertheless visible to anyone who might be observing from inside the ballroom. Richard approached with the weariness of a man who had been fighting a losing battle all evening. His earlier confidence had been replaced by something approaching defeat, though he maintained enough pride to keep his shoulders straight and his expression neutral. The conversation they were about to have would determine not just the remainder of the evening, but the future of the elaborate fiction he had constructed around his personal life. "We need to talk," he said simply, stopping at her side near the doorway. "Yes," Isabel agreed, not turning to face him immediately. Instead, she gazed out at the garden where other couples strolled among the roses, their quiet conversations adding to the evening's romantic atmosphere. "I think we do." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, two people who had once shared everything and now shared nothing but history and a legal document neither had bothered to dissolve. The weight of their 15-year marriage hung between them. The good years, the difficult years, and the final year when they had become strangers living in the same house. "Why tonight?" Richard asked finally. "After 3 years of silence, why choose this particular evening to resurface?" Isabel considered the question carefully before responding. "Because," she said quietly, "I realized that silence can be interpreted as consent, and I found I could no longer consent to being erased." The words were delivered without anger or accusation, but they carried a weight that made Richard shift uncomfortably. He had expected rage, tears, or dramatic confrontation, anything but this calm, reasoned response that somehow felt more devastating than any emotional outburst could have been. "I never intended," he began. "Yes, you did." Isabel finally turned to face him, her dark eyes holding his with steady intensity. "You intended to rewrite our history, to replace me in the narrative of your life as if I had never existed. The young woman you've brought tonight is lovely, Richard, but she's playing a role that was never vacant." Richard felt something twist in his chest, guilt perhaps, or recognition of a truth he had been avoiding for 2 years. "Our marriage was over, Isabel. We both knew it. We were living like strangers." "Our marriage was difficult," she corrected him. "There's a significant difference between a relationship that needs work and one that needs to be buried and forgotten. You chose the latter without consulting the other party involved. The accusation hung between them, impossible to deny. Richard had indeed made unilateral decisions about their future. First the affair, then the gradual introduction of Sophie to his social circle, then the systematic erasure of Isabel from his public life. At each step, he had told himself he was simply moving forward, but Isabel's words forced him to confront the possibility that he had been engaged in something more deliberate and cruel. "What do you want?" he asked, and immediately regretted the bluntness of the question. It made him sound like a businessman negotiating a hostile takeover rather than a husband speaking to his wife. Isabel smiled at the question, and for a moment he glimpsed the woman he had fallen in love with 20 years earlier. Intelligent, perceptive, and utterly unimpressed by his attempts at manipulation. "I want acknowledgement," she said simply. "I want recognition that I existed, that our marriage mattered, that I cannot simply be written out of your story because you've found a more convenient narrative. The legal complications are entirely of your own making," she interrupted, her voice remaining calm despite the steel beneath it. "You could have filed for divorce 3 years ago. Instead, you chose to pretend I had simply disappeared. That was your choice, Richard, not mine." The truth of this statement was undeniable. Richard had avoided divorce proceedings not out of hope for reconciliation, but because they would have required acknowledging the end of his marriage publicly. It had been easier to let people assume Isabel had simply chosen to fade away. Easier to gradually introduce Sophie as his companion and then his unofficial wife. The legal complications he now faced were entirely the result of his own strategic choices. "Sophie doesn't know," he said quietly, and immediately realized how pathetic the admission sounded. "Doesn't know what? That you're still married? That she's been living a lie for 2 years?" Isabel's voice carried a note of genuine surprise. "Good heavens, Richard. You've managed to deceive both of us, haven't you?" The observation stung because it was accurate. Sophie believed she was his partner, his future wife, once the formalities were sorted out. She had no idea that those formalities had never even begun, that her entire relationship with Richard was built on foundations that were not just unstable, but completely fictional. "What happens now?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Isabel gazed back toward the ballroom, where Sophie could be seen sitting alone at their table, looking increasingly isolated as conversations flowed around her without including her. For a moment, something that might have been sympathy crossed Isabel's features. "Now," she said quietly, "truth has consequences. You've spent 2 years constructing an elaborate fiction, and tonight that fiction collides with reality. The collision was inevitable, Richard. I simply chose the time and place." Through the French doors, they could see guests beginning to return from the terrace as the orchestra prepared for the evening's final set. The intermission was ending, and with it their moment of private conversation. Whatever happened next would unfold before the watching eyes of London's social elite. "She doesn't deserve to be humiliated," Richard said, nodding toward Sophie. "No," Isabel agreed, "she doesn't. But neither did I deserve to be erased. The situation we find ourselves in tonight is the inevitable result of choices you made 2 years ago. I'm not responsible for resolving the complications you've created." With that, she moved away from him, returning to the ballroom with the same graceful composure she had maintained throughout the evening. Richard remained by the French doors for another moment, watching his wife, for she was still his wife, whatever else might be true, as she rejoined the social gathering that had once rejected her absence and now celebrated her return. The decisive conversation was over, and Richard understood that he had not been negotiating with Isabel at all. He had been receiving notification of a decision she had already made. The only question remaining was what that decision would cost him, and whether he possessed the courage to face those consequences with any measure of dignity. As he finally moved to rejoin the party, Richard caught sight of his reflection in the glass doors. The man looking back at him seemed older than his 52 years, worn down by the weight of maintaining lies that had finally become too heavy to carry. The perfect night had become a reckoning, and the final act was about to begin. As the evening moved toward its natural conclusion, Isabel began her departure with the same calculated precision that had marked every moment of her return. She did not wait for the formal end of the gala, nor did she attempt to create a dramatic scene that would overshadow the event's charitable purpose. Instead, she chose her moment with perfect timing, late enough that her presence had been firmly established, early enough that her departure would be noted and discussed. The orchestra was midway through their final set, playing a haunting melody that provided the perfect backdrop for elegant farewells. Couples swayed on the dance floor, while others lingered over final glasses of champagne, reluctant to let the magical evening end. It was precisely the kind of moment when a graceful exit would be remembered as stylish rather than abrupt. Isabel began with her hostess duties, approaching the event organizers with the kind of gracious gratitude that marked her as someone who understood social obligations. She found Margaret Thornfield near the charity auction display, where the final bids were being tallied for the evening's fundraising efforts. "Margaret, darling," Isabel said warmly, taking the older woman's hands in hers. "What a magnificent evening! The foundation should be thrilled with tonight's success." Mrs. Thornfield beamed with pleasure, both at the compliment and at the opportunity to secure Isabel's future involvement. "I cannot tell you how wonderful it is to have you back among us, Isabel. Your insights tonight about educational outreach programs were exactly what our board needs to hear. I do hope you'll consider rejoining our planning committee." "I would be delighted," Isabel replied, and the commitment was genuine rather than merely polite. Her academic research had indeed given her valuable perspectives on educational initiatives, and she found herself genuinely excited about the possibility of applying her scholarly work to practical charitable efforts. "Please have your secretary contact me at Belgravia. I believe I can contribute meaningfully to your literacy programs." The exchange was brief but significant. With a few words, Isabel had re-established herself as an active participant in London's charitable community, not as someone seeking to return after a period of disgrace, but as someone whose temporary absence had enhanced rather than diminished her value to important causes. Her next stop was Lord Pemberton, who had been one of Richard's most important business connections. The conversation here required more delicate handling, as it touched on both social and professional relationships. "Charles," she said, approaching him with the familiarity of long acquaintance, "I wanted to thank you for your kind words about my research. It means a great deal to have support from someone whose judgment I've always respected." Lord Pemberton's response was precisely what she had hoped for. "Nonsense, Isabel. Your work sounds absolutely fascinating. I had no idea you were pursuing such serious academic endeavors. I confess, I've always admired your intellectual curiosity, but this doctorate represents a remarkable achievement." "Thank you. I find that stepping away from social obligations for a few years gave me the freedom to pursue interests I had neglected during my busier periods." While the phrase was carefully chosen, it suggested that her absence had been a deliberate choice rather than a retreat, and that her return represented a new phase of engagement rather than a desperate attempt to reclaim lost ground. As she moved through the room, saying farewell to old acquaintances and new connections alike, Isabel's departure began to take on the quality of a royal progress. People lingered in their conversations with her, reluctant to let her go, eager to ensure that her return to society would include them in her future plans. The woman who had entered the ballroom as a memory was leaving as a presence, someone whose absence would be felt and whose future appearances would be anticipated. Near the coat check, she encountered an awkward moment that she handled with characteristic grace. Sophie stood waiting for Richard, who was nowhere to be seen, looking lost and uncomfortable in a way that emphasized her youth and inexperience with such situations. For a moment, the two women, the wife and the mistress, found themselves alone together for the first time all evening. Isabel could have walked past without acknowledgement, or she could have created the kind of confrontation that would have provided gossip for months. Instead, she chose a third path that demonstrated both her natural kindness and her strategic intelligence. "Miss Hartwell," she said quietly, approaching Sophie with neither hostility nor artificial friendliness, "I hope you've enjoyed the evening." Sophie looked up with surprise, and something that might have been relief. The neutral tone of Isabel's address suggested that no public humiliation was forthcoming, which had been her greatest fear for the past hour. "Yes," Sophie replied carefully. "It's been educational." Isabel smiled at that, recognizing the honesty in the response. "These events often are. I learned a great deal about myself during my years of attending them, and even more during my years of avoiding them." The comment carried no malice, but it highlighted the fundamental difference between them. Isabel spoke from a position of experience and choice. She had attended these events as an equal participant and had chosen to absent herself for reasons of her own. Sophie, by contrast, attended as an accessory to someone else's life, without the security of genuine belonging or the freedom of authentic choice. "I hope your future is filled with more genuine experiences," Isabel added gently, and with that cryptic blessing, she moved toward the exit. Her final farewell was to Lady Pemberton, who had been watching the evening's developments with the keen interest of someone who would be responsible for transmitting accurate accounts to the rest of society. "Caroline, thank you for such a warm welcome back," Isabel said, embracing the older woman with genuine affection. "I realize my long absence from society may have caused some confusion about my circumstances. I'm grateful for the opportunity to clarify matters." Lady Pemberton's eyes sparkled with understanding and anticipation. She had witnessed one of the most elegant social comebacks in recent memory, and she understood that she would be expected to provide detailed accounts to anyone who had missed the evening's drama. "My dear Isabel," she replied meaningfully, "clarity is always appreciated. I suspect many people will be eager to renew their acquaintance with you in the coming weeks." With that final exchange, Isabel collected her wrap and made her exit. She did not look back for a final glimpse of Richard or Sophie, did not pause for dramatic effect, did not allow any suggestion that her departure was motivated by emotion or uncertainty. She simply left as she had arrived, with perfect timing, impeccable grace, and absolute control over the narrative she was creating. The doorman helped her into the waiting taxi with the deference shown to someone whose status was unquestionable, and as the car pulled away from the hotel, Isabel allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. The evening had accomplished everything she had hoped for, and more. Behind her in the ballroom, the perfect night was ending with conversations that would echo through London's drawing rooms for weeks to come. The legend of Isabel Monteverdi's return had begun, and with it the slow but inevitable unraveling of the fiction that had temporarily replaced her. 3 weeks after the Charity Foundation Gala, the ripples of that extraordinary evening continued to spread through London's interconnected social circles, like ink diffusing through water. What had begun as a single night's entertainment had evolved into a defining moment that would reshape relationships, reputations, and futures in ways that none of the participants had fully anticipated. In the elegant drawing room of her Belgravia townhouse, Isabel sat surrounded by the familiar comfort of her books and papers. But her morning routine now included reviewing a steady stream of social invitations that had begun arriving within days of her reappearance. The Whitmore Foundation wanted her expertise on their educational initiatives. Lady Pemberton had invited her to rejoin the Cultural Arts Committee. The Historical Society was eager to hear her speak about Victorian women's literature and its relevance to contemporary social issues. Each invitation represented more than mere social restoration. They acknowledged her as someone whose 3-year absence had enhanced rather than diminished her value to the community. Her academic credentials had transformed her from a wealthy man's wife into an accomplished woman whose insights were sought for their own merit. The transformation was both personally satisfying and strategically valuable. The telephone call she had been expecting finally came on a rainy Thursday morning. Richard's voice, when she answered, carried a weariness that had not been present 3 weeks earlier. "Isabel," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss the practical arrangements." She set down her research notes and gave him her full attention. "Yes, I suppose we do." The conversation that followed was remarkably civilized, conducted with the courtesy of former intimates who had moved beyond anger into something approaching mutual respect. Richard acknowledged what they both knew, that his attempt to maintain the fiction of his relationship with Sophie had become untenable. The social pressure following the gala had made it impossible to continue presenting her as his wife, and the legal complications of his actual marital status could no longer be ignored. "Sophie has returned to her flat in Kensington," he said quietly. "She's considering an offer from a gallery in New York. I think a fresh start might be best for her." Isabel felt a genuine moment of sympathy for the younger woman who had been caught in the complicated web of Richard's deception. Sophie had played her role beautifully, but she had been playing a role that was never truly available to her. The kindest outcome was indeed a fresh beginning, preferably in a place where she could build something authentic rather than borrowed. "And us?" Isabel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Divorce," Richard said simply. "Properly handled this time, with full legal recognition of your contributions to our shared assets and appropriate financial arrangements. I should have done this 3 years ago." The admission carried weight beyond its practical implications. Richard was acknowledging not just the failure of his recent deception, but his earlier failure to handle their separation with dignity and honesty. It was perhaps the most mature conversation they had shared in years. "I think that would be best," Isabel agreed, "for both of us." The legal proceedings, when they began, were conducted with unusual efficiency and mutual respect. Richard's financial advisors worked with Isabel's newly retained counsel to develop arrangements that recognized her legitimate claims, while allowing both parties to move forward independently. The Belgravia house would remain hers. It had become her sanctuary and workspace, and Richard had no desire to disrupt the scholarly life she had built there. Other assets were divided fairly, with the understanding that Isabel's future would be built on her own achievements rather than dependence on Richard's continued success. The social consequences were more complex and ultimately more interesting. London society, having witnessed Isabel's elegant return and Richard's obvious discomfort with his exposed deception, rallied around her with the enthusiasm reserved for someone who had triumphed over adversity with exceptional grace. She had become something of a romantic figure, the accomplished woman who had transformed betrayal and abandonment into academic achievement and personal growth. Richard, by contrast, found his social standing subtly but definitively altered. He was not ostracized. His business connections remained solid, and his professional reputation was unaffected by his personal failures. But he was now seen as someone who had behaved poorly toward a woman who had shown nothing but dignity in response to his treatment. The whispered conversations in club lounges and private dining rooms did not focus on his affair, which might have been forgiven as a common masculine failing, but on his systematic attempt to erase his wife from their shared history. That kind of cruelty was less easily overlooked by people who valued loyalty and authenticity above convenience. 6 months after the gala, Isabel published her first academic paper in a prestigious literary journal. The piece, examining how Victorian women writers had used their work to challenge social hypocrisies, was widely praised for its insights and meticulous research. Speaking invitations followed, along with opportunities to contribute to important cultural discussions that had nothing to do with her former status as anyone's wife. On a crisp autumn evening, as she prepared for a lecture she would deliver at the Royal Institution about women's economic agency in 19th century literature, Isabel reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had once defined herself through her relationship to Richard had discovered something far more valuable, a sense of purpose and achievement that belonged entirely to her. The telephone rang as she was gathering her notes, and she was pleasantly surprised to hear Margaret Thornfield's voice. "Isabel, darling," Mrs. Thornfield said excitedly, "I have the most wonderful news. The Education Foundation has decided to implement your literacy program proposal. The board was unanimous. They want you to head the entire initiative." The offer represented a significant commitment. Heading such a program would require substantial time and energy, but it would also allow her to apply her academic research to practical social improvement. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had hoped to find when she began her scholarly pursuits. "I would be honored," she replied, meaning it completely. As she ended the call and prepared to leave for her lecture, Isabel paused to look around the study that had become her sanctuary during those difficult years of separation and discovery. The room was filled with books, papers, and the artifacts of serious scholarly work. But it was also filled with something else, the quiet contentment that comes from knowing one's worth is not dependent on anyone else's recognition or approval. The night of the gala had been a turning point, but not in the way anyone might have expected. It had not been about reclaiming a lost position or seeking revenge against those who had wronged her. Instead, it had been about asserting the simple truth that she existed, that she mattered, and that she could not be written out of any story, including her own. As she stepped out into the London evening, ready to share her research with an audience who valued her insights, Isabel Monteverde walked with the confidence of someone who had discovered that the most powerful social position of all is the one built on authentic achievement and genuine self-respect. The echo of that night at the gala would continue for years to come, not as a scandal to be whispered about, but as an example of how dignity, patience, and authentic accomplishment could triumph over deception and social manipulation. It was a lesson that resonated far beyond the drawing rooms of Mayfair, touching anyone who had ever felt erased, overlooked, or undervalued. Some presences, once truly established, can never be diminished by others. They can only choose to diminish themselves. Isabel Monteverde had made her choice, and it had nothing to do with anyone else's opinion of her worth. Step into the glittering ballrooms of London's elite and witness one of the most masterful displays of dignity and strategy ever crafted in fiction. The London Gala tells the breathtaking story of Isabel Monteverde, a woman who transforms 3 years of abandonment and betrayal into the ultimate comeback. When her husband Richard parades his young mistress as his wife at society's most prestigious event, he believes he has successfully erased Isabel from his narrative. But he hasn't counted on the power of a woman who has used her exile not for bitterness, but for brilliant self-transformation. Watch as Isabel arrives in that stunning emerald gown and systematically dismantles Richard's web of lies with nothing more than grace, intelligence, and the unshakable truth of her own worth. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a celebration of authentic achievement over borrowed status, of quiet dignity triumphing over loud deception. Every chapter reveals new layers of Isabel's masterful strategy as she reclaims not just her social position, but her entire identity as an accomplished woman in her own right. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated or erased by someone else's narrative, this story will resonate with your soul. Like this video, if you're rooting for Isabel, share it with someone who needs to see how true class handles betrayal. And subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of dignity over drama. Tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? And have you ever witnessed or experienced this kind of social transformation? Your stories and perspectives from around the world make our community richer.